So we couldn't think of a better topic to start the second season of Brainstorms than addiction. In part, of course, because it's such a pressing issue across the world, and then particularly in the United States. Also, we here at UT have one of the best addiction research centers in the world. We have the Waggoner Center for Alcohol and Addiction Research. We're one of the world's best at this. And so we thought, what better way to start than an important topic that we're really good at talking about. And so today's speaker is Micky Marinelli. She's an associate professor, and she's in the Department of Neuroscience and a part of the Waggoner Center. And she's going to lead you through this primer about addiction and the way to think about it. And I hope you enjoy yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. It's nice to see so many of you here today. So I come here today with two hats. The first is a hat of a neuroscientist. And as a neuroscientist, it's a really privileged job. Not only do I get to see how the brain works and test hypotheses and ideas and then have further ideas develop, but I also get to interact with a huge group of wonderful colleagues and peers. Among those are from, high-level professors to lower-level postdoctoral fellows, graduate students, undergraduates, and even high school students. In fact, even today I've seen several who have worked with me over the summer. I'm really, really happy to see you here today. So thank you, all the high school students that have come here today. And as I work as a neuroscientist, I try to understand the factors that put someone at risk for addiction. Throughout my research, I've also interacted with other people in the field. In particular, Laurie Holloran has put up a pop-up institute for substance use and misuse, and we met every week for a year, and I had the chance to interact with wonderful people from the School of Social Work mostly. I also, like many of you, I'm sure, have touched addiction around me in very close proximity with dear people around me. I remember following a trace of little blood spots to realize that my boyfriend had relapsed to heroin. I remember holding my mentor's hand when he passed away of substance use disorder. And all these events have really touched me to try to make my research more relevant and to try to tackle it and do everything I can to move it forward. And then I come to you with a second hat, the hat of a parent of an at-risk kid. And if I was passionate of my work before, it's nowhere close to how passionate I am now. Boy, I really want to solve this now that I'm a parent of an at-risk kid. So throughout my talk, I'll describe my scientific work, but I can't help talk as a parent as well. And as a parent, I'll mostly be talking to young people in the audience and parents who have kids who have issues as well. For those of you who are scientists and has never seen my side, you'll see I'm pretty feisty about it. So because I'm so passionate, I've put together a lot of stuff with the bottom line message that we have to rethink addiction. So whether as a scientist or as a parent, I think that's really the bottom line. And to do that, we're going to first tap into two domains, the affective domain and the cognitive domain. In the affective domain, I'm going to ask you what your thoughts about addiction are. And to do that, you're going to walk inside your head, like John Lennon is doing right here, and examine what you really believe about addiction. I'll then explain what scientists know about addiction, give you a definition, and tell you why drugs are addictive. Spoiler, there's a dysfunction of brain and behavior, but this dysfunction can be exacerbated by a whole bunch of risks that I'll be talking about. At that point, my time will probably be up, but if I can, I'll also tell you the value of human and rat research and how successful treatment is and the impediments to treatment. And Throughout the process, I'll ask you to re-explore what you think about addiction. And again. So again, it's a lot of work, so I'll try to speak very fast. I'll also end with ways that you can help solve this problem as well. The work that I'm going to show to you today was funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and I'm very grateful that my lab is funded by that, and the work of other scientists that I'm going to be showing you is also funded by NIDA. NIDA provides research funds to many of us in different fields, and without it, we definitely couldn't do the work. So a while back, many years ago, if you were caught high, maybe taking something that was hallucinogenic, you would act maybe crazy, and people would think, you're not ill, you're just crazy. And they would punish you severely, up to death. They used to think that people needed to be punished because addiction is not an illness. Therefore, it should be punished. So what is your belief about addiction? Is it not an illness and should be punished? Or is it an illness and therefore it should be treated rather than punished? Or maybe a way between. So how about a wave of hands? Those who think it's an illness, wave their hands that way, so you would be doing this. And those who think it's an illness, wave your hands that way. Oh my gosh, I have people doing this now, what do I say? But the majority of hands were really going that way. So the majority of hands think it is already an illness and it should be treated, at which point my idea of having you rethink what addiction is wouldn't make sense. So if you're definitely over here, one of those who thinks it's not an illness, you have to rethink everything. If you are someone who sort of thinks halfway between, you have to rethink everything. But I have the audacity of believing that even if you said that it is an illness, you still have to rethink everything. Because I'm not really sure you really think that. So let me test it. I think you think that people with addiction should ultimately be, to some extent, punished and isolated. So let's imagine we have Hart and Brian, two young men, and both of them have to go to work in the morning and take their car. Hart, like many white American men today, has hypertension, type 2 diabetes, he overeats, he doesn't exercise, he indulges in stuff he shouldn't do, and he knows perfectly well he shouldn't be doing that, but you know what? You know, it's okay. He's a ticking bomb for a heart attack. He knows it. He's a little bit overweight, and that morning he has breakfast, bacon and eggs. He sets out on his car and has a heart attack and kills people in a bus. How many of you think Hart should go to jail? None of you. Well, let's imagine Brian. Brian also has to go to work that morning. His heart is fine, but he has an addiction disorder. He knows it just as much as Hart knows it. And he takes his car under the influence and hits someone and kills someone. Now, how many of you think Brian should go to jail? Now, you see, you think of the two disorders in a very different way, right? You think somewhere inside you, you have the belief that he's not responsible for the health of his heart, but he is responsible for the health of his brain. Somewhere you think that he should do something about it, but it's okay if he doesn't. It's not his fault. So now, why do you think differently for people who have a disease of different organs? You see, it's really difficult to think of it really as a disease. And even I, as a scientist and as a mother of an at-risk kid, have a hard time myself not immediately thinking that this is not really a disease, but they should do something about it. He can eat all the bacon and eggs he can. If he has a heart attack, it's not his fault. So now, where do you stand? You see, you don't stand here quite so much, or you stand there and said, but he should be held responsible for it, not the other one. I'm going backwards by mistake. So we've examined what's in your brain, and maybe it wasn't quite what you expected it to be. Now let's talk a little bit about factors that influence addiction and what we know about addiction. And still examine as we go along. So what is addiction? So the definition of addiction is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM. And the DSM has really evolved over time, the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and the definition of addiction has evolved as the DSMs have evolved. In the first DSM, it was called drug addiction. In the second DSM, it was called drug dependence. And in those two DSMs, it wasn't a disease per se, it was part of personality disorders and other non-psychotic mental disorders. It's not until the DSM-3 that it became its own unit. At that time, substance use disorders, abuse and dependence, then DSM-4, and finally the DSM-5 that has substance-related and addictive disorders. And under that, there are two categories: substance use disorder that I'll talk to you today about, and behavioral addictions for the first time. In the definition of substance use disorder, never does the word addiction appear. So why on earth am I calling it addiction? So if you understand, my accent is not quite the standard American one. I was born and raised in Italy, and in Italy, people learn Latin and the etymology of words. And so the word addiction comes from the Latin ad dictum, which means to give someone to make someone, assign someone to someone else. So when someone had a debt that they couldn't pay, they were assigned to the person they owed money to until, with slavery, they paid back the debt. So really, it's this notion of slavery behind the word addiction that I like, and that's why I use it. What are the characteristics of addiction? And they have really evolved over the years. So early on, the only definitions were tolerance and withdrawal symptoms. But as things progress, all these other categories came into play, which didn't exist before. So why is it that the definition changed and we're now starting to see new behaviors that weren't described before? Well, it's because the drugs themselves changed and the methods of delivery of the drugs changed, and we're learning more and more about it. So I sort of see addiction similar to war. Okay, so imagine war. War in the Stone Age might have been fought with sticks and stones or whatever they did. And then as you get into the Middle Ages or the Roman period and then evolve and keep going, you'll have maybe swords, then you'll have guns, then you'll have, rifles, or luckily I don't know the names of weapons, but they keep going to more complicated ones until maybe you just push a button and some nuclear thing happens. It's still called war, but the damage it does, it's totally different. And the same thing with addiction. So early on, maybe you just smoked. And then new delivery devices came along, and things got into your bloodstream faster, and more of them. And the drugs themselves changed as well, from simple to more complex to designer drugs. And so the definition changed as all of these things changed too. Now, why do people start taking drugs in the first place? To do that, I'll go through something that I don't think will be very easy, but let's walk through it step by step. I'll go through what's called behaviorism. People who believe in behaviorism, and other people, believe that you can change behavior according to a reaction that you get. And in fact, I leave this section as well. So let's say you have two buttons, and you press those two buttons, and you press one of them or the other. That's a behavior. A behavior that by itself means nothing at all. Pressing a button doesn't do anything. But if it starts doing something, then the behavior can be either increased or decreased according to what that something is. So let's imagine that I want a behavior to be increased. I press the button, something favorable happens. Maybe a big, nice smell of roses comes into the room every time I press a button, so I'll press it over and over again. My behavior is reinforced to press that button. That's called reinforcement. Or maybe when I press the button, something negative goes away. Let's say there's a terrible screechy sound of the air conditioning unit, and I press the button, it goes off. I feel better. So that will also reinforce me to press that button. We think that that will give me the motivation to do it again. We call this positive reinforcement because you are adding something. We call this negative reinforcement because you're removing something. So you add something positive or you remove something negative. The net result will be I do more behavior. Okay? You can do less behavior with the opposite. You can punish. So you can punish by adding an unfavorable effect or removing a positive effect. Let's say you press the button and you get a little electric shock. You won't press it again. Or you press the button and your chair collapses. You won't press it again. So something well, I guess that's still unfavorable. Something, maybe you have a beautiful music playing and now you press the button and the music go away. You won't do it again. So with this framework here in mind, we can imagine that people do the same thing with drugs as well. And the idea behind punishment is that it gives you insight not to do that thing because it gives you something negative. And you could do the same with drugs. Some people believe, and it's possible, that you're taking the drug because it creates a favorable effect or removes an unfavorable effect. What are these effects? Well, for the favorable ones, it could be some sort of pleasure or the craving, the wanting of the drug, something that you want to do again. Therefore, you take more drug. But it could also be that it fills a void. So it removes this negative feeling that you have inside. Two different, very different reasons why you might be doing that. Now, why doesn't this work? You know, I just told you that this would increase behavior and these negative things would decrease. Let's just do them and then you're done, you're solved. Well, for people with addiction, that system does not work. It's gone. In fact, sometimes it's gone even before they become addicted. And I left insight there because it's uncertain. At least for some people, insight is completely there. They just can't stop it, okay? They have the insight, but they can't do anything about it. According to these authors, then people take drugs for the motives of pleasure, either external, in a social setting, they have a very pleasurable effect, or internal, for a personal enhancement. Or they take drugs to remove something terrible that they feel, either external, for example, they can't be in public, they're really uncomfortable, but taking the drugs makes them, okay, I can do it. Or some terrible internal feeling. People who are unable to cope, they have not learned how to cope, and the drug for them is their solution. So when they take the drug, they'll say, that's not my problem, that's my solution. The people in this category feel like doo-doo. And therefore, they'll take the drug to at least cope. Now, if someone's saying, are they self-medicating? Well, unfortunately, when they take the drug, they'll actually cope worse. So they'll do worse, okay? But definitely, they'll feel that that's the only thing they can do to just go by another day or another minute. Once you take the drugs for those reasons, or even purely accidentally, or because your doctor gave them to you for some pain, then they start changing the brain. I don't have time to show this. In fact, this is just a still. But after the talk, if you Google Nuggets by Andres Hikade, I don't know how to pronounce it, you'll see this 5-minute video that's beautiful that really shows you the different phases of trying the drug, feeling the high, then not really feeling it but needing it, and then really pretty much being destroyed by the drug. So those are the reasons why people might start, but there are reasons that make things even worse. There are risk factors. And what are these risk factors? There are several. So biology, like your age, the younger you are, the more vulnerable you are. Maybe your genes. Mental illnesses are huge. The comorbidity between mental illnesses and addiction is very large. Then the environment as well is pretty bad when things are going wrong. They all interact together to cause a dysfunction of brain and behavior that will lead to addiction. Of course, you have to have the drug there to begin with. Here's a typical example of people who live in adversity and are drug users, more likely to be drug users, versus people who live in a beautiful setting, very nurturing, and do not take drugs. The question here is, did this woman end up on the streets because she was taking drugs? Or is she taking drugs because she's living on the streets? Is it the chicken or the egg? And it's virtually impossible to do this in humans. You don't know which came first. That's why it's hard to study humans, and that's why we study rats. Now, I know, I just told you, you feel sick, you feel like doo-doo, you feel positive, and all these things that you might feel about drugs can be told to you by humans. And when you ask a rat, it's a little harder to really tell. So I don't quite get that aspect, but I do get what exactly they do, which is something that humans don't always tell you correctly. They might remember wrong. They might kind of remember wrong, or they might not want you to know, or they might not be aware of what they're taking. So in that respect, rats is a really good model because you can measure exactly what they're doing and evaluate the effects of all of these conditions beforehand. So if I make something environmentally adversive, am I going to increase drug intake? If you have drug intake, will I be more sensitive to the adversity of the environment? Are adolescents, do they have a different brain, or do they just have more access to the drug? So I give equal opportunity to take drugs to everyone, let's put it that way, and then can figure out what matters. So how do we study rats? Let's study the brains of rats. We put a little electrode in the brain, and we can record the activity of the neurons in the brain. I'll show you recordings of the dopamine neurons that I'm sure you all heard of. And how do we study behavior? We study different phases of behavior, trying to mimic the human phase. So first, drug use. Then we can put them into rehab, let's put it that way, where they extinguish their drug-seeking or taking behavior. And then we can do different stimuli to see if they induce relapse. And if we had to graph it, it would look like this over time. This is their response rate over time. Here you see their use. Here they try to find the drug, but they can't. So eventually they learn and they stop seeking the drug. And then there might be different stimuli that increase it. So how do we get a rat to take drugs? Our lab mostly studies cocaine. We don't get it on the streets. We buy it at a commercial vendor. It looks like that. We put it into solution, and then we put the solution into a syringe. And the syringe contains the cocaine, the liquid cocaine, and it's hooked up to the vein of the rat. So every time a rat does a behavior, in this case puts its nose into a hole, we call that nose poking, it receives a shot of cocaine directly into its bloodstream. And it will do it again and again and again. And we can study the different phases over here. So the first thing I did here, and this was really old work when I was a postdoctoral student with my mentor, whose hand I was holding when he passed away, was to study the effects of drug intake onto the brain, onto the dopamine reward system. So rats either self-administered saline or cocaine, and then I studied their brain at different withdrawal time periods. So you're going to now listen to what a control brain sounds like versus one that has been on drugs. This is, and you'll see these each activity is when the neuron fires and is active. So that's the activity of a control rat. Now, this is a rat that has taken cocaine. Pretty impressive. Now, I can even take the brain out, put it in a petri dish, and record it ex vivo, and it will still be so active. Now, you go tell that brain, don't look for drugs. He's zoomed up. There's very little you can do. It's like a horse that's galloping and you try to rein it in. While some things increase in the brain, some other things decrease. Here's an example of a former cocaine user. And this is the activity in the brain of a control. You'll see a lot of activity, bright colors, a lot of activity, and less brightness, less activity. In this case, specifically in the prefrontal cortex. That's important for executive function. Now you tell this person, think straight. It's similar to telling someone that has a dementia, try to remember. The activity simply is not there and cannot keep it, cannot do it. This low level of activity of certain brain areas is no different than the low level of activity of the heart of a heart disease patient compared to a healthy heart that has a lot of activity. So the brain is equally sick as the heart. And yet again, we have a hard time really feeling it. So think a little bit now, knowing that the brain is so wired differently once it has experienced drug, how difficult it is to not take drug. I'd like to now show you a few studies that we did in rats. And first of all, on adversity. So I just showed you exposure to drugs and now stress and adversity. So stress comes in many forms. And again, we don't know in humans which comes first. You could have food scarcity, very common. You could have social isolation, either naturally happening or imposed by society. You can be exposed to cold. You can't quite have maybe electric shocks that frequently with tasers, except if you have some event with police, but you could have fights, and you definitely could have family negative interactions, because as a parent, it's so hard to see all this happening and not get upset. And we can mimic all this in animals. So in the case of food scarcity, we just reduce the amount of food they have for a long period of time, or take it totally away for one day. Isolation, we can either group house their animals or isolate them. Cold, we did a study where we exposed them to cold for just 4 minutes. Electric shocks, we can give them mild electric shocks, mild like 0.3 milliamps, very mild. And fighting, we can mimic fighting by putting an intruder in their cage, which generates fighting. So once we do this, we can record in these basal conditions the activity of their dopamine neurons. And guess what? It's high. And consequently, the addiction is high as well. So if you put all of these rats in a condition to take drugs, they will use more drug. And interestingly, they will be immune to changes in price. You know how you change the price, you up the price of cigarettes and people stop taking them? Yes, but not people who are stressed. They don't stop. No matter how much you increase it, they'll still go after it. Their motivation for it is much, much higher. So all these stressful conditions that people live are really priming them to be worse off. Relapse and seeking is another big thing. We talked about the two, and I didn't show you any data, but the two interact. So if you are stressed and you add drug to that condition, the increase in dopamine that the drug produces is much bigger than if you are not stressed. But also, if you've taken drug before and now have been without drug for a long period of time, now you stress the rat, it'll be sensitive, like if you just even blow on it, it will feel it. Whereas a control, it won't. I'm exaggerating blowing on it, but still, it's much more sensitive to stress than a control rat. So basically, when you say, hey, that's not a big deal, you didn't have to relapse, really that was nothing. Well, it was nothing to a neurotypical brain, but a brain that has been exposed to drug reacts much more to the stressor. So I'm going to show you a little bit, very briefly, about age. And age is questionable, right? So we all think, of course kids are taking drugs, that they're all over the place. Well, I can control for that in rats. And what do adolescent rats look like? Well, they look like this, just like humans. And these guys here, oopsie, let me play them again, are just adults. And their addiction is bigger, and their dopamine activity is bigger. In fact, the dopamine activity looks as if they've already taken drug, but they haven't, or they've already been stressed, but they're not, or maybe they are just because they're adolescent. I don't remember. So adolescence is definitely a risk factor. Your brain is different, and you're more vulnerable to drugs. Well, how about punishing? Can we just punish them? We used electric shocks as a stressor, but what if we were able to pair them right exactly with when we catch them taking drugs? Could we stop it? I showed you that thingy about punishment that should work. Why can't we do it in rats? Well, let's try. So to punish rats, we put them in the self-administration chamber and give them a little shock every time they take the drug. So as soon as we get them, we do that. And so the behavior, these are not my studies, they're work by Serge Ahmed, is that their intake, here is the number of percentage of intake, it's 100% to begin with. When we punish, it goes down. And then the next days it stays down. That's great. But these were just adult rats that were just taking 1 hour of cocaine a day. They weren't addicted. What if we test an addicted rat, giving them a lot of cocaine? Well, when we test addicted rats, it don't work, okay? So punishment will not work in an addicted state. Okay, it doesn't work in an addicted state, but you know what? I don't care. Let's do it in adolescence. Here we replicated the study. This is from our lab. And let's hit them right there so they stop and they don't fall into that trap, right? So let's do it even if they take recreationally. But they don't. It's like they're already addicted. So punishment does not work in an addicted state and does not work at a young age. Okay, I am running short of time. Let's look quickly at genetics. Genetic risk is done by looking at usually identical twins. If you haven't looked at that movie, watch it, it's beautiful. And using that, they have realized that there's a lot of genetic risk for addiction and for different drugs of abuse. I'm going to go so fast that you might want to take pictures if you want to remember these. Here's a family tree. And let's imagine that these two parents, both using drugs, so females are round and males are squares, have this kid and his sister, which I don't know where she is, but I know that he has an addiction to methamphetamine. He goes with this woman and has 3 children, but because he neglects them and abuses them, they're taken away to the foster care system. So this is gone. He goes with this person over here. She comes from a mother who takes crack and a father who is depressed but doesn't have an addiction. And together, they have this kid over here. Same thing happens. Abuse, neglect, foster care system. I guess he's not satisfied. He goes with this other woman over here. and together they have this kid over there. Now these kids that have been abused, neglected repeatedly, that they have been exposed in utero to drugs, that they have parents with psychiatric disorders, bipolar perhaps, depression, what is their chance? How hard is it for them? Who are we to judge if they fall into it, saying it's their fault? Now, when I was talking to someone who's in recovery about this, he got a little mad, said, you can't do it. I have free will. If I didn't believe that I had free will, I would have never stopped. I'm not saying you don't have free will. I'm just saying it's much harder than it is for anyone else. It's very difficult, but it definitely can be done. So think a little bit where we are. Oh my goodness, I'm like halfway through. I will have to skip quite a bit of it at the end. So if we go back to behaviorism, that's where my mother hat comes in. We said that we can, check on behavior. And unfortunately, behaviorism is used poorly. So people think that we can prime good behavior by reinforcing it to increase the motivation and reduce it by punishing it. But the reality is that if someone doesn't behave, it's not necessary because they lack the motivation. And even if they did, it has been proven over and over that it actually does the opposite in the long run. Okay? So if you reward a child for doing some charity work, that child couldn't care less about charity anymore. He'll just care about the reward. On the other hand, if you try to probe into intrinsic motivation, you might tap into different values. So because of this, though, some kids, those who have been abused, for example, have a messed up circuitry, and they really cannot do it well. They lack the skill, not the will. So things like charts, where they have nothing and all the other kids have everything, or things like dangling a carrot in front of them, what will it do? Just make things worse, more frustrating, because they can't reach it. And also, things like they refused, they chose to go to miss recess, or the punishment to try to give them insight on their behavior, what will they do? They'll make them more depressed. They look exactly like the environmental things that have primed the brain to be more addicted. We should give them other things rather than adversity and punishment. And the same thing, this is a wonderful book that I recommend to everyone by Ross Greene that teaches skills to problem solve when there are problems. The same thing for drugs. These people don't have this, so giving them tough love will only make it harder for them. And books by someone, William Kelly at this university, have described how the punishment does nothing to cure their mental disorder. So is desire to change necessary? Of course it is, but it's very difficult. Here are excerpts from the internet. You're housing sick kids together in an RTC and they have no internal drive to get better. It comes down to you can lead a horse to water. Those who don't desire to heal. There's no way he can learn if he doesn't experience the consequences. Parents are just enabling him. They should just let him go in the streets. Or the client is not engaged. He does not want to change. There's little I can do. So I had 5 volunteers. I'd like you 5 volunteers to come up with what you wrote. I have asked 5 volunteers to write a wish, a hope that they have in their life. So why don't you come up on stage? Whoever feels like it. So are you okay for me to paraphrase it?
Sure.
So they vary from finding a lifelong partner to traveling more to getting better grades to being healthy. Now, how do you feel?
Disappointed and dismissed.
Anyone? Your dreams go down the toilet. They don't have motivation to change. You see where I'm going? Someone who tries over and over to do something but don't have the skill to do it, and they get bashed over and over. They don't have the skill, it's not the will. This happens every day in people who try. So we must be thankful that they. Thank you. I'll clean it later. This is an excerpt from that child that you saw had issues before. Their dreams. What do I want? I try my best. I hope nothing. Okay, this is where we're going with our rewards and punishment. Shame is what mediates the relationship between depression and addictive behaviors. That's not the way to go. So as I said, risk factors can increase the risk, but we can also be protective. What are the protection factors? Things like exercise, things like environmental enrichment, connection. If anyone has known about this experiment rat park, that will tell you something about it. So it's more like connection, a sense of meaningfulness, a sense of belonging that might be more likely to help someone rather than isolation and punishment. Well, does treatment work? You know, hell yes, it works just as much as all the other diseases. Look at this. Addiction has a relapse rate of 40 to 60%, hypertension 50 to 70%. Yet somewhere we think this means it doesn't work, and this does work. The main difference here is that this is a chronic condition and must be treated as a chronic disorder. You can't send someone to rehab and say, okay, you're done, now go back to your dangerous environment and be done. No, it's a chronic condition. It's a lifetime condition, just like hypertension. I don't know what's going on. Help. Okay. So how many of you came here knowing someone or with someone, not completely alone? How many of you came completely alone and didn't know anyone? Don't know anyone in the audience. So there are more people who came together. Why? It's easier to do things together, right? And this was an easy thing. So imagine recovery from addiction. That's why safe places or alternative peer groups, this is one created by one of our panelists, Hannah Milne, and safe places like the Sounds Bar here in Austin are a place that people can go and feel safe and together boost up, you know, because it's so hard otherwise. If you want more information, there's National Institute of Drug Abuse, SAMHSA, and MAMI, and always trust things that end in edu and org, but beware of things that end in .com. They're commercial, they want your money, okay? At the university, we have the University Sober High School here and the Students for Center in Recovery that are safe places. And I could not exist without this group called Brave Parents. Stephen Terry, the director of it, is now here in the audience, and we have some pamphlets over there if anyone wants them. There are some impediments to treatment. The main one is the misbelief that treatment doesn't work. Very few receive treatment, and it's a stigma. So how can you help? Well, change that. And change this. And by doing that, you will rethink addiction and hopefully help stop this otherwise devastating disorder. Thank you very much.